The house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its weathered walls whispering secrets of the past. Inside, it was unnervingly silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood. Javier had lived there for years, but ever since his wife, Lucia, had returned from her last trip to her hometown, the house felt different. Heavier, darker. Lucia, once full of laughter, now barely spoke. Her eyes, once filled with light, were now clouded and distant. Javier glanced at her from across the dinner table, her pale face framed by the dim light of a flickering candle. She stared blankly at her untouched plate, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Lucia, are you feeling all right?" Javier asked, his voice breaking the heavy silence. Lucia did not respond. She only looked up, her lips twitching as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Javier's concern turned to frustration. It had been weeks since she had uttered a single word, and every attempt to communicate was met with the same eerie silence. Doctors could find nothing physically wrong with her. It was as though something had stolen her voice and locked it away. One night, as Javier lay in bed beside his silent wife, he heard faint whispers. He sat up, straining his ears, but the house was silent as a tomb. He glanced at Lucia, whose eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. For a moment, Javier swore he saw her lips moving ever so slightly, mouthing words he couldn't hear. He leaned closer, his breath hitching in his throat. "Lucia," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But she remained silent, her lips still and eyes unblinking. Javier pulled away, his heart pounding. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The whispers grew louder in the following days, always at night, always faint but persistent. They seemed to come from the walls, the floors, and sometimes, chillingly, from beneath the bed. Javier tried to brush it off as his imagination, but the feeling of dread clung to him like a second skin. One evening, desperate for answers, he ventured into the basement, a place they rarely visited. Cobwebs draped the corners, and the air was thick with dust. As he searched, his eyes landed on an old, wooden chest that had belonged to Lucia's family. It was ornate, with strange carvings etched into the sides, symbols Javier didn't recognize. The chest was locked, but he found the key hidden beneath a loose floorboard. With a hesitant twist, the lock clicked open, and Javier slowly lifted the lid. Inside were faded photographs of Lucia's family, strange trinkets, and a small, leather-bound journal. Javier picked it up, flipping through the pages filled with Lucia's handwriting. His eyes widened as he read. It wasn't just a journal. It was a collection of dark family secrets, tales of curses, and forbidden rituals. One entry caught his eye. She tried to speak of the past, of the sins we cannot undo, and the silence consumed her. To speak is to summon them. To break the silence is to invite them in. Javier's blood ran cold. He slammed the journal shut and stumbled back, dropping it as if it had burned him. The whispers suddenly intensified, louder and closer than ever. It felt as though the walls themselves were breathing, groaning with a malevolent life of their own. Javier raced up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind him. That night, he couldn't sleep. The whispers seemed to seep through the walls, louder and more coherent. It was Lucia's voice, soft, pleading, and filled with sorrow. But it wasn't coming from her. It was coming from everywhere. Javier clutched his ears, trying to drown out the sound, but it was useless. The next morning, Javier confronted Lucia, gripping her shoulders tightly. "What did you do? What happened to you? Why won't you speak?" Lucia's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. In her silence, Javier saw fear, guilt, and something else, resignation. She pointed shakily to the mirror in the corner of the room. Javier hesitated but approached it, his own reflection staring back at him. But then, the image began to change. Lucia's reflection moved on its own, her mouth opening in a silent scream. Dark shadows swirled around her reflection, pulling at her, tugging her deeper into the glass. Javier stumbled back, horrified as the room seemed to shift and warp around him. In the mirror, Lucia's reflection began to speak, though no sound came out. Her lips formed words Javier couldn't hear, but he understood. She was begging for help, trapped on the other side, imprisoned by whatever curse had stolen her voice. Javier reached out to the mirror, but his hand met cold, unyielding glass. He watched helplessly as the shadows consumed Lucia's reflection, leaving only darkness in their wake. Javier turned to the real Lucia, who stood motionless, tears streaming down her face. She reached for his hand, her grip ice-cold, and for the first time in weeks, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Forgive me." Before Javier could respond, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. He felt a cold breeze, and the whispers returned, louder, angrier. It was as if the house itself was alive, haunted by whatever curse Lucia had brought back with her. Javier turned on his heel, but the door slammed shut. The walls began to close in, and Lucia's form flickered like a glitching image. The whispers turned into screams, voices of the past clawing their way into the present. Javier fell to his knees, clutching his head, as the house seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Lucia's last words echoed in his mind, mingling with the screams, until there was nothing but silence. Days later, the house was found abandoned. Neighbors spoke of the eerie quiet that hung over it like a shroud. No one ever saw Javier or Lucia again. But on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear faint whispers coming from the walls, a desperate voice begging to be heard, trapped in silence forever.